You're listening ad-free on Amazon Music. On Sunday, September 18th, 1994, Jennifer Thompson went to the county fair for the fourth day in a row. Growing up in the tiny town of Orofino, Idaho, not much usually happened. So 14-year-old Jen wasn't about to waste the most exciting days of the year. Back on Thursday, Jen and her friends had gone on all the rides from the carousel to the Ferris wheel, and then on Friday they went to the county livestock auction, and Saturday was the parade, and now on Sunday they had already watched the log cutting competition, and as they had, they totally gorged themselves on every kind of food the fair had to offer. Corn dogs, funnel cakes, cotton candy, caramel apples, and also all the soda they could drink. Now it was time to go home, and Jen was feeling completely full, like she had just eaten an entire Thanksgiving dinner. Still though, she and her friends each bought one more corn dog for the road before taking one last walk around the fairgrounds and saying their goodbyes. When Jen got home, her dad Dennis was on the phone and her mom Sherry was busy making dinner. So Jen just went upstairs to her bedroom. She had a bunch of homework she needed to finish before school on Monday. Jen liked school sports a lot more than school work, but she was in 8th grade now, and she didn't want to fall behind. So she grabbed her math assignments out of her backpack and worked on equations until her mom called her for dinner. Jen made her way downstairs and sat down at the dining room table. Her mom had made one of Jen's favorite meals, chicken and rice casserole. But after all that junk food at the county fair, Jen really didn't have an appetite. So she mostly picked at her plate and told her parents all about her day at the fair, and about how sad she was that it was now over. After dinner, Jen's mom asked Jen if she wanted any dessert, and despite her very full belly, Jen said yes. And so before long, Jen was crushing a big bowl of vanilla ice cream, and then afterwards, she helped her parents clean up before she went back upstairs to her bedroom. Once there, she finished her homework, and then just went to bed early. She wanted to be well rested for school the next day. When Jen's alarm went off in the morning, she dragged herself out of bed and shuffled into the bathroom. But when she turned on the light, a sudden sharp pain shot through her stomach. She doubled over and grabbed the bathroom counter to keep from falling down. For a second, Jen felt like she was about to throw up, but she breathed through the pain, and slowly the cramp sort of went away. Jen released her grip on the counter and straightened up again. She stood for a moment, afraid the pain might come back, but everything seemed okay. Jen told herself that most likely she had just eaten too much at the fair and she was still feeling it today, and so she just went back to getting ready for school. After brushing her teeth, Jen got dressed and slid the math homework from last night into her backpack. Then she zipped up the bag, slung it over one shoulder, and started going downstairs. But about halfway down the steps, another sharp shooting pain cut through Jen's abdomen, and this did not feel like any sort of normal bellyache she had ever had. It felt more like something was trying to tear its way out of her stomach. Jen dropped her backpack and kind of hunched forward, clutching at her stomach. The next thing Jen knew, her mom was at the foot of the stairs, looking up at her with a mixture of confusion and concern on her face. Jen barely had time to tell her mom that she was in pain and feeling sick, before suddenly a big wave of nausea hit her, and she had to run back upstairs to the bathroom, where she vomited and also had diarrhea. A few moments later, Jen's mom, who had gone upstairs as well, knocked softly on the bathroom door and asked Jen if she was okay. Jen called out no and said she felt absolutely horrible. She said something was definitely wrong with her stomach. Through the door, Jen's mother suggested that Jen stay home from school that day. Jen was relieved, but was too nauseous to reply. When Jen's father, Dennis, got home from working at a local car dealership that evening, he went straight upstairs to check on his daughter. Sherry had told him that Jen was having a lot of stomach pain, and both parents agreed that the 4 days of crushing sugar and fried foods at the county fair was very likely responsible for this pain. But when Dennis walked into Jen's bedroom, he was shocked by how miserable she looked. Her face was red and her hair was damp with sweat. Jen told him she'd been throwing up and having diarrhea all day. Her stomach ached when she was lying down, but it hurt even worse when she was standing up. And some of the cramps were so intense, Jen said they made her cry. Dennis brushed a strand of hair out of his daughter's face, then said he was going to get her a glass of water. When he went downstairs, Sherry was waiting in the kitchen, and she would tell him that the only thing Jen had been able to stomach all day was just a few bites of ice cream. and she had been running a low-grade fever for hours. Both parents were very concerned now, but they weren't quite sure what to do. They knew their daughter absolutely hated going to the doctor, and so they agreed that, maybe now was not quite the time to take her yet. For now, Dennis and Sherry decided they would just continue giving their daughter water and Tylenol and check on her throughout the evening. Eventually, despite all her discomfort, Jen would fall asleep, and after she did, Dennis went to bed hopeful that his daughter would feel better soon. 2 days later, on Wednesday morning, Dennis got out of bed and walked upstairs to his daughter's room. But when he went inside, Jen barely stirred. She'd hardly eaten anything for 2 days, but still her stomach cramps had only gotten more painful and more frequent, and she was still running a fever, she was still vomiting, and she was still having diarrhea. Dennis knelt next to his daughter's bed and shook her shoulder until she slowly blinked awake. Then he told his daughter he had bad news. She clearly was not improving, so he and her mother had decided it was time now to go to the doctor. Jen groaned, but she didn't put up a fight, and to Dennis, this was actually a bad sign. His daughter was clearly so sick that she wasn't even trying to avoid the doctor. Dennis helped Jen get out of her bed and let her hold onto his arm for stability as they made their way down the stairs and out to the car. Then Dennis backed out of the driveway and headed to their usual family medicine clinic. A few minutes later, Dennis helped Jen climb onto an exam table, and he could tell she was struggling just to sit upright. Before long, Jen's longtime pediatrician, Lyndon Bishop, came into the room, and he was surprised to see his athletic, young patient looking so ill. He listened closely as Dennis explained his daughter's symptoms, and all the while, Jen just silently sat there, clutching her stomach and leaning forward. Dennis told Dr. Bishop that he was pretty sure his daughter had food poisoning from something she must have eaten at the county fair. But when the doctor gave Jen a quick physical examination, he said that he thought Dennis was actually wrong, that this was something else. Because he said, food poisoning usually only lasts for 1 to 2 days, and Jen had been in pain for over 3 days. And so Dennis was taken aback by this, but he understood the logic. Dr. Bishop asked Jen if she had any history of stomach pain. Her father was about to answer for her, but then Jen lifted her head up and said yes in a weak voice. But that was all she could manage to say before she had to slump forward again. At this point, Dennis stepped in and he explained that not long ago, Jen had suffered from debilitating cramps in her lower abdomen for seemingly no obvious reason. Dennis and Sherry had taken their daughter to a gynecologist who found that one of Jen's ovaries was swollen to 3 times its normal size. Fortunately, this swelling was not cancerous, and eventually Jen's cramps had just kind of gone away on their own. Dennis admitted that, when Jen first got sick after the county fair, he didn't even think about her swollen ovary because her illness was so much worse this time. He didn't think a swollen ovary could give his daughter symptoms like a fever, diarrhea, and vomiting. But Dr. Bishop said he did think it was possible. Maybe Jen was ovulating, and that caused the swelling to return, and her symptoms came back even worse than before. It was the best and really only theory they had for now. So Jen was ultimately sent home with strict instructions to come back if the pain got any worse. Dennis was disappointed there wasn't more they could do for the moment, but he trusted Dr. Bishop's judgment, so he helped Jen off the exam table and walked her back out to the car. He leaned the passenger seat all the way back so Jen could lie down, and then as they drove home, Jen curled into the fetal position and began moaning. It made Dennis feel terrible to see his daughter suffer so badly when he really couldn't do anything to help her. But he reminded himself what Dr. Bishop had said right before they left. Don't worry, Jen will feel better soon. Later that evening, Dennis tucked his shivering daughter into bed. Sherry had gone out of town to visit the couple's other daughter. Dennis was going to be holding down the fort by himself along with Jen, and so far everything seemed to be okay. At least Jen was resting. Dennis put on his pajamas, brushed his teeth, and climbed into bed to watch TV, but as soon as he turned it on, he heard his daughter screaming, so he jumped out of bed and sprinted to Jen's room. When he got there, he found his daughter lying on the floor, curled up into a ball with tears streaming down her face. Jen kept screaming that she'd never felt anything that hurt this badly. She said she literally felt like she was going to die. In a total panic, Dennis ran back downstairs to the living room. He grabbed the phone and called the nearest emergency room. A receptionist answered and patched him through to a nurse, and Dennis explained what was happening, and the nurse paged Dr. Bishop, and he responded immediately, saying, "You know what? It sounds like Jen has appendicitis." The nurse told Dennis to bring his daughter to the emergency room immediately. In severe appendicitis cases, the appendix can burst open inside the body, causing complications and even death. And so if Jen had acute appendicitis, then she would need surgery to remove her appendix as soon as possible. By the time they made it to the hospital about 20 minutes later, Jen was barely coherent. Dennis lifted her out of the passenger seat and carried her into the emergency room. Under the bright fluorescent lights, he could see that his daughter's face was bright red and drenched in sweat. As soon as Dennis approached the check-in desk with his daughter in his arms, the receptionist called for the nurse who he'd spoken to on the phone. Within moments, the nurse and other members of the hospital staff loaded Jen onto a gurney, and Dennis followed as they wheeled his daughter into a nearby exam room. The nurse began taking Jen's vital signs and saw that she had a fever, she was severely dehydrated, and her pulse was distressingly high. The nurse began to explain to Dennis what his daughter's vital signs could mean, but then a short man wearing glasses and a white coat entered the room. He introduced himself as Dr. Maurice Mazer, and he'd already been briefed up on Jen's condition, so he went straight to her bedside and began examining her. He began to press lightly on the lower right-hand side of Jen's abdomen to check her appendix. The doctor's prodding seemed to wake Jen up, and she began to cry out in pain and tried to push the doctor away. Dr. Mazer said that it did look like Jen had appendicitis. This would explain her extreme abdominal pain, her fever, and her confusion. The doctor said the only treatment was an emergency operation to remove her appendix, like right now. But as Dr. Mazer reviewed Jen's medical charts, he told her father that something didn't look right to him. Jen's white blood cell count, her body's natural defense, was going down. The doctor said the number of those cells should be soaring right now as Jen's body fought off this appendicitis. Dr. Mazer said the drop could mean two things. Either her infection was getting better, which seemed very unlikely based on how sick Jen still appeared, or her appendicitis was getting so severe that it was overwhelming her natural defenses. And so Dr. Mazer told Dennis that bottom line, he believed Jen's appendix needed to be removed immediately. Otherwise, his daughter's life could be in danger. Dennis looked at Jen, who looked absolutely terrified. Tears filled her eyes as she said she didn't want to have surgery. But all Dennis could do was promise her that she would feel better when it was all over. And then he gave his daughter a gentle hug before the nurses took her away to be prepped for surgery. Jen's mother, Sherry, returned from visiting her other daughter just in time to find Dennis sitting in the hospital waiting room. The couple spent the next hour waiting on the edge of their seats until finally Dr. Mazer entered the waiting room and sat down beside them. Right away, the doctor said Jen's surgery had gone smoothly and she was okay, but then Dr. Mazer frowned. He explained that while Jen's appendix did show modest signs of infection, it wasn't nearly bad enough to cause the agony she had been going through. The parents were confused. Their daughter had been rushed into emergency surgery to remove her appendix, but now that that was done, it sounded like it might not have been necessary. But Dr. Mazer, who was sensing this in the parents, assured them that they'd actually done the right thing, because during the course of this operation, Dr. Mazer had discovered something very unsettling about Jen. Jen's whole intestinal tract looked red and inflamed, and Dr. Mazer didn't know why. And so, in short, because of this operation, it was discovered that Jen's appendix was not badly infected. However, the rest of her digestive system was. And so Dr. Mazer said he hoped Jen would feel better now that her appendix was out, but he just wasn't sure if that had really done anything to fix the issue. Dennis and Sherry turned to each other in amazement. Neither of them were comforted by the idea that Jen might or might not feel better. It sounded like she had a dangerous infection that the surgery hadn't really touched. But there was nothing they could do about that now, so Dennis grabbed a magazine off the waiting room table and began to read, doing his best to distract himself until he could see his daughter again. 1,200 miles away at that very moment, a different and yet eerily similar story was playing out in rural Minnesota. A young nurse named Callie Vins was working in a small local medical clinic, and it was totally packed. Normally, it was not her job to check patients in, but there were so many people crammed into the small waiting room that the receptionist needed Callie's help. Callie pushed her short dark hair out of her face, feeling totally overwhelmed. She was an experienced and highly capable nurse, but the past few days had really pushed her to her limit. Dozens of teenagers had come into the clinic with fevers, diarrhea, vomiting, and extreme stomach pains. One of the doctors who worked at this clinic thought the teenagers had the flu, but to Callie, that didn't make any sense. For starters, if this was the flu, then why were only teenagers getting sick? Why not their parents or younger siblings? And why didn't they have runny noses, coughs, or any of the other respiratory symptoms typically associated with the flu? Callie heard the bell above the front door ring as yet another nauseous teenager and their parents stepped inside. Looking around at the waiting room full of sick kids, Callie knew she needed to do something. Whatever was going on here, she did not believe their small clinic was equipped to handle it. Callie turned and told the receptionist that she'd be right back. Then Callie made her way through the crowd of people and into the back of the clinic. At the nurse's station, she pulled out the office phone book and found the number for the Minnesota Department of Health. As soon as a representative answered her call, Callie described the mysterious outbreak in her small rural town. The representative told Callie to collect saliva, urine, and stool samples from all the patients and send them in to the health department for testing. This way, state analysts could try to figure out what was causing this widespread illness. Callie thanked the official and then hung up the phone. As one of the clinic's doctors rushed past her on the way to visit yet another patient, Callie pulled them aside and explained what they needed to do. A couple days later, 14-year-old Jen Thompson was back at home in Orofino, Idaho, lying on the living room couch and watching TV. She'd been released from the hospital, but so far, recovering from her appendectomy had been very difficult. The incision on her lower abdomen was always itchy, her stomach ached constantly, and she could barely keep food down. Plus, on top of that, she'd never been so bored in her life. It had only been a little over a week since she got sick, but she already just felt so isolated. She missed going to softball practice and spending time with her friends. She even missed school, which was something she never thought she'd say. Jen picked up the TV remote and began flipping through the channels trying to find something she wanted to watch. But then suddenly, this sharp, totally overwhelming pain filled her stomach, and it was so intense it made her drop the remote. The pain she was having felt just like the cramps she had had before her surgery. Jen's bottom lip started to tremble. She called out for her dad, and a second later, Dennis rushed into the room. Jen was in so much pain she could barely breathe, let alone talk. But as soon as Dennis walked into the room, she really didn't have to explain anything to him. He could see clearly how much pain his daughter was in, and so a second later he had ran out of the room, got Jen's mother, and got the car keys, and then within minutes, the entire Thompson family was back on the road, heading to the hospital. Less than an hour later, Jen was lying on a hospital bed with Dr. Mazur standing over her. Dr. Mazur pressed lightly on Jen's abdomen and said her incision seemed to be healing fine. But clearly, something other than appendicitis was making her sick. Dr. Mazur said he was beginning to wonder if maybe Jen was suffering from an infection that was inside of her intestines. So he ordered a stool sample to be tested for a number of different bacteria. The idea of foreign bacteria inside her digestive tract really freaked Jen out, but it wasn't nearly as bad as what Dr. Mazur said next. Bacterial testing would likely take at least 24 hours to complete, and he didn't think they had any time to waste. Dr. Mazur was worried that he'd missed something along the way, so he suggested an exploratory surgery to see if he might be able to determine the source of her illness. Jen had already gone through one surgery, and the idea of being cut open again was almost too much for her to handle. She looked at her parents, wishing they could save her from this. Her mother looked like she was about to cry, while her father was just shaking his head back and forth. But Dennis told the doctor that if another surgery was what they had to do, then that's what they had to do. And deep down, even though Jen did not want to do this surgery, she knew he was right. So, despite Jen's deep anxieties, nurses began prepping her for the operation. They hooked her up to an IV and then cleaned the skin on her belly where the scalpel would cut her open. All the while, Jen felt like she was going to throw up, both from nerves and also from her illness. But just as the nurses were about to wheel Jen back into the operating room, Dr. Mazur came running into the room saying the surgery would not be necessary after all. The hospital lab was not very busy that day, so they'd been able to expedite the stool sample tests, and now he knew the source of Jen's illness. It would turn out Jen's illness was not from her enlarged ovary or from appendicitis. The doctor said she had a potentially deadly microorganism living inside her digestive tract. Now, it most likely came from something she ate, but the doctor said he had no idea what that could be. However, on the positive side, Dr. Mazur said that, while this microorganism was very dangerous, there was a very effective treatment that they could begin right away. As Jen's treatment began, 3 states away, a man named Larry Edmondson was standing in his office at the Minnesota Department of Health, staring at a large map that he'd taped up on his wall. It was a detailed picture of the state of Minnesota, and Larry had stuck a number of red thumbtacks into the map to mark different locations. Larry was leading the investigation into the mysterious disease outbreak in his state. After nurse Callie Vins had called the Minnesota Health Department, Larry and his team had received dozens of biological samples from patients at Callie's clinic. They tested each one, and they too discovered the source of the outbreak. It was the same microorganism that infected Jen in Idaho. But Larry didn't know about Jen. He thought the microorganism was only in Minnesota, and right now he was trying to figure out exactly where it came from. The Minnesota Health Department had continued receiving calls from medical clinics across the state, reporting patients with similar symptoms. Every time Larry got a call, he would send a representative to interview the sick patient and also to collect samples of anything they'd eaten recently. Then Larry put a red thumbtack on the patient's location on the map. He had hoped these red thumbtacks would be more concentrated in one particular area, allowing him to sort of pinpoint the origin of the disease outbreak. But the thumbtacks were spread out in a way that looked totally random. Larry didn't know what to make of this, but he knew that with each passing day, more people were getting sick. While Larry Edmondson puzzled over the Minnesota outbreak, representatives from the Idaho Health Department were digging through Jen Thompson's kitchen. As they did, Jen watched them from her spot on the living room couch. It had been just one day since Dr. Mazur diagnosed Jen, and she was already feeling much better. Dr. Mazur prescribed some antibiotics that were working well, and for the first time in over a week, Jen didn't feel nauseous. She could finally keep food down, but she was scared to eat anything that came from inside her house, because it might contain the deadly microorganism. Jen looked on as the employees pulled fruit, vegetables, cheeses, and meats out of the refrigerator. They took small samples of each item and sealed them inside of small labeled baggies. Jen heard them tell her parents that they would test the samples and let them know the results as soon as possible. Dennis and Sherry thanked them, and then the employees left. As soon as they were gone, Jen's dad walked into the kitchen and took all the food out of the fridge and out of the freezer and just dumped it into a trash bag, went into the backyard, and threw it away. When he came back inside, he told Jen they'd just go grocery shopping for new food tomorrow. That way they would know for sure that whatever they bought was safe to eat. At the Minnesota Health Department, Larry Edmondson had collected hundreds of food samples from the homes of people who had gotten sick. Now, microbiologists were hard at work testing those samples to determine which, if any, contained the deadly microorganism causing all the illness. Larry entered the lab to find 2 analysts staring down at a line of petri dishes. They looked up when they heard him come in, and he asked them for an update on their progress. And one of the analysts said that Larry's timing actually couldn't be any better, because they had just found something he needed to see. Larry immediately rushed over to them to see what they were talking about. He knew that each of these petri dishes contained a swab from the food samples that the health department had collected. The lab analysts were watching all of them for signs of this microorganism, and all of these samples currently looked normal, except for one, which had grown a whole bunch of small black circles all over the sample. Larry's eyes widened when he saw it, because those black circles were a telltale sign of this deadly microorganism. He asked the analysts which food that sample came from, and they said it was from ice cream. Larry quickly reviewed the records from his investigation, and the truth dawned on him. Every person who had fallen ill had recently eaten ice cream from a company called Schwann's. And now the health department had proof that this ice cream contained this deadly microorganism. Larry almost wanted to cheer, but he reminded himself that this was not really a time to celebrate. He was sure that the company, Schwann's, had no idea their ice cream was poisoning people, so Larry would have to call them right away. A few days later, Larry sat in his office at the Minnesota Health Department feeling very frustrated. This case just kept getting more difficult. When Larry had called the ice cream company Schwann's, he learned something very concerning. Schwann's ice cream was not typically sold in grocery stores. Instead, it was delivered directly to customers' doors all across the United States. Now, Larry still knew nothing about 14-year-old Jen Thompson's severe illness out in Idaho, but he now understood that this disease outbreak likely went far beyond Minnesota. On the bright side, though, Schwann's had been extremely cooperative. As soon as they learned their ice cream was tainted, they shut down their factory and recalled all of the potentially contaminated products. Schwann's delivery drivers were going door to door across the nation, informing customers of this outbreak and collecting tainted ice cream. But the Minnesota Health Department still hadn't figured out how the microorganism got into the ice cream in the first place. And that was the only way to prevent this disaster from happening again. Larry read over a report from one of his colleagues. They had swabbed miles of stainless steel piping at the company's giant manufacturing plant, but none contained any trace of this microorganism that sickened all the teens. So where was it coming from? Minnesota officials had expanded their investigation to include the company's distribution system, and so Larry's coworkers were now analyzing the company's trucks, trying to see if maybe the product was contaminated during shipping. Just then, Larry's phone rang, and he picked it up, hoping it would be one of his colleagues with good news. But it wasn't. When Larry answered, he heard a man's nervous voice, and this man said he had a tip about the department's ongoing food safety investigation, but this man was calling from a payphone because he wanted to stay anonymous. When Larry heard this, he sat upright, pressing the phone hard against his ear. He told the man that was fine. Larry didn't need his name, he just needed whatever information he had. So the man whispered that he was a truck driver, and the company he worked for shipped two kinds of cargo: bulk ice cream for Schwann's and unpasteurized liquid eggs. The driver said that the same trucks could carry liquid eggs one day and ice cream the next. And then in between, the refrigerated cargo tanks on the back of the trucks were supposed to be thoroughly cleaned so that there was no contamination from one load to the next. But the tipster said one driver had not been given the right cleaning supplies to disinfect their vehicle after hauling thousands of gallons of liquid eggs. So bacteria from the unpasteurized eggs contaminated the entire truck. And so as soon as the Schwann's ice cream was loaded into that truck, the ice cream got contaminated. Larry thanked the driver for coming forward. Because of him, the Minnesota Health Department could finally close this case. Larry immediately went to his supervisors and told them the whole story. When that cargo truck wasn't cleaned properly, it turned into a giant incubator for a type of deadly bacteria found in unpasteurized eggs called salmonella. The salmonella bacteria then mixed with a giant shipment of Schwann's vanilla ice cream. And so after 14-year-old Jen Thompson got home from the county fair on Sunday, February 18th, 1994, she did her math homework, she ate her dinner, then right before bed, she ate a bowl of the contaminated Schwann's vanilla ice cream. And so, of course, she and her parents had no idea that her dessert was full of salmonella bacteria. And so as a result, Jen just kept eating more and more of this contaminated ice cream each time she felt sick, because it was really the only food she could actually stomach. And so as this bacteria continued to multiply inside of her body, she got sicker and sicker. Jen and her family had no idea the ice cream was behind her illness until sometime in mid-October, when a Schwann's delivery driver came to their door and asked to take the contaminated ice cream back. The Schwann's salmonella contamination was one of the biggest mass poisonings in American history. In total, there were 593 confirmed cases of salmonella poisoning across 41 states and as many as 5,000 suspected cases nationwide. However, some experts estimate that there may have been nearly 225,000 people who got sick from this tainted ice cream. They just didn't report it. The ice cream company, Schwann's, paid out thousands of settlements to victims and changed their shipping procedure to make sure this contamination could never happen again. As for why the illness predominantly struck teenagers, it was likely due to two factors. One, young people tend to eat more ice cream, and two, young people tend to be more shy or embarrassed to talk about gastrointestinal issues than their more senior counterparts. And so as a result, maybe they began having symptoms and could have gone to the doctor and dealt with them, but in fear of being embarrassed, they didn't go to the doctor and let this condition get worse and worse and worse, and then finally it turned into a full-blown emergency room visit. But very few of the people who got salmonella poisoning had symptoms as severe as 14-year-old Jen Thompson. Even after having her appendix removed, she had to undergo at least 3 more surgeries to fix her damaged digestive system, including having her gallbladder taken out. The salmonella also caused her to develop a rare type of arthritis. To this day, Jen still lives with chronic pain, all because of a few bowls of ice cream she ate back in 1994. Just after midnight on June 22, 1991, Charles Holden was on his way home from work when he decided to stop at a fast food restaurant near his house in Harrington, Delaware. After grabbing a quick bite to eat, Charles left the store and got back in his truck. He turned it on and he was about to drive out of the lot when he stopped because there was this man running towards him, waving, trying to flag him down. So Charles put his truck back in park and he rolled his window down to see what this guy wanted. And when this stranger got close enough, he told Charles that his sister was having a baby and he needed a ride to the hospital, which was about 20 minutes away. Charles couldn't tell if this guy was lying. It was super late. He didn't know this guy, and he just had a bad feeling about him. And so he told him, "No, I'm sorry. It's too late. I gotta get home. It's too far out of the way." The stranger immediately looked dejected and turned around and started walking away. And as Charles was watching him go, he felt bad and said, "You know what? Hey, come back here. I'll give you a ride part of the way there." And so the stranger smiled, hopped in his passenger seat, and they took off. Charles drove him approximately 3 miles in the direction he had asked to go before pulling over on the side of the road and telling him, "This is as far as I'm going to take you." Charles lived only about a block away, and he didn't want to drive too far away from home so late at night. But the stranger, upon hearing he was being let out so soon, suddenly became angry and began fumbling in his pocket like he was going to get a knife or some sort of weapon, and he starts screaming at Charles, "Hand over your keys, hand over your wallet, or I'm going to kill you." Charles, meanwhile, was on edge, just being in the car with this guy because he had a bad feeling about him, and so he immediately jumped into action. He turned off his truck, he ripped the keys out of the ignition, and he leapt out of his truck and started running. Charles saw way off in the distance was a convenience store, and he figured he could run to there and get some help. But as he's running, he turns around and sees the stranger has also leapt out of the car and was now sprinting up to him with a screwdriver in his hand. And this stranger was running really fast. He was gaining on Charles, and soon Charles realized he wasn't going to make it to the convenience store before this guy caught up to him. And so at some point, Charles just stops, he turns around and puts his hands up and he says, okay, I'll give you a ride wherever you want to go, and then you can have my keys, my wallet, you can have anything you want. And so the stranger runs right up to Charles and he stops and he smiles because he's very pleased with this result. And he pokes him with the screwdriver and kind of gestures for him to go back to the truck. So Charles walks back to the truck with the stranger right behind him with the screwdriver periodically poking him in the back. They finally get to the vehicle and the stranger tells Charles to get in the car and then wait. But as soon as Charles sat down, he fired up his truck and sped off before the stranger could hop in the passenger side door. And so Charles is flying away from this guy. He looks in his rear view mirror and he can see the guy is chasing after him with a screwdriver held over his head, but he sees the stranger at some point just stops, turns around and walks away. Charles was totally relieved that he had escaped this horrible encounter, and he was thinking about calling the police, but ultimately decided he wouldn't because it was his decision to allow some stranger to get in his car in the middle of the night. And so Charles kind of blamed himself for the whole ordeal. What Charles was concerned about, though, was where he had ditched the stranger was not far from his house, and he was worried if he just turned around and drove right back to his house that this guy could recognize the truck and then follow him to his house, and then who knows what could happen. And so Charles decides he's just going to stay outside of town and drive around for a while to make sure this stranger is long gone by the time he comes back. So after about an hour of doing just that, driving around outside of town, Charles goes back into Harrington, Delaware, and he gets on his street, and he's shocked when he sees the stranger who had just tried to kill him is is walking down the road right in front of him. But luckily, the stranger did not hear or see Charles pull onto his street, and so Charles immediately throws it in reverse and he gets out of there and he drives off. At this point, Charles decides he needs to tell police because he doesn't know if this stranger actually knows him and that maybe he's targeting him and he's waiting for him at his property. And so he calls 911 and he tells the dispatcher about what had happened earlier and how this guy is now lurking around his property. And the dispatcher tells him they'll send an officer out to him. And so a few minutes later, an officer showed up at the payphone where Charles was, and they told Charles they would escort him back to his property, and if this stranger was still out in the area, they would arrest him. And so the two of them made their way back to Charles's property. They get there, the stranger's long gone, and then Charles goes into his house. There's no sign of a break-in. There's no sign that anyone was near his property. And so Charles thanks the officer. He feels totally relieved. But before the officer leaves, he asks him if he wouldn't mind doing a quick sweep of his mother's property. She lived right behind Charles on the other side of some bushes. He told the officer her name was Dorothy. She was 70 years old and she lived alone. And he just wanted to make sure nothing happened to her. So the officer said, no problem, I'll go check in on her. So the officer leaves Charles and goes across his backyard through those bushes into Dorothy's backyard. And right away, he can see the back window on the back door has been smashed and the door itself is slightly ajar. And so the officer draws their pistol and they go up and they enter the house and they look inside. They're yelling for Dorothy, but there's no answer. It's totally dark in the house. It's totally silent. And so after searching the first floor and finding nothing, they make their way up the flight of stairs and they find blood at the top of the landing. And they follow this trail of blood and it brings them into one of the bedrooms where a woman is sprawled out on a bed. It was Dorothy. She had been stabbed to death. It would turn out, after Charles had ditched the stranger and sped off without him, the stranger, whose name was Gilbert Cannon, began looking for a place to sleep, and the house he ultimately selected just happened to be Charles's mother's house. After Gilbert broke in through her back door, he saw Dorothy coming down the steps to confront him, and because he was worried she'd be able to identify him, he attacked her with a screwdriver. Gilbert would later tell police that the attack on Charles was completely random. He was just at this fast food restaurant, he saw Charles get into his truck, and he thought to himself, if I can get in that guy's truck, I bet I can rob him. And then after this failed robbery, when Gilbert is out looking for a place to sleep and he breaks into this house and this woman comes down the stairs that he attacks and kills, he has no idea that this woman, Dorothy, is Charles's mother. The entire night was one big, horrible coincidence. Gilbert would plead guilty to the murder and would be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In 1949, 15-year-old problem child Ken Rex McElroy dropped out of school and moved to a tiny farming town called Skidmore, Missouri. There, he began his life of crime, which consisted primarily of theft. At night, he would drive his truck onto Skidmore residents' property, and he would steal their livestock, alcohol, grain, food, antiques, anything he could get his hands on and that he could sell, he would take. And if the owners ever caught him in the act, he would just raise his rifle at them and tell them to go back inside and never report it to the police or he would kill them. And because Rex was this big 270-pound monster of a man who was known for having a bad temper and for being really aggressive, people generally just did what he asked and his crimes went totally unreported. In the rare instances that victims would report Rex's crimes to police, Rex would begin intimidating them and their family by staking out their houses at all hours of the night, or he would just walk directly up to these victims and he would say, "I will kill you if you testify against me." And if none of those tactics worked, Rex used some of his illegal money to hire one of the very best defense lawyers in the entire state, a lawyer who had famously represented the mob, and he would step in and get Rex off of virtually any charge, including the time Rex actually did shoot one of the owners who caught him in the act. Over the years, Rex would use these fear and intimidation tactics not just to make money, but also to prey on young women and girls. In the 1970s, when Rex was in his 40s, he began stalking a local Skidmore girl who was 12 years old named Trina. After assaulting her dozens of times, Rex learned her family was going to be pressing charges against him. So Rex burned down Trina's family's house and killed the family dog, and then threatened to kill the entire family unless they signed paperwork that would legally marry their daughter Trina to Rex. This would protect him legally in case they pressed any charges against him. After the family finally relented and signed off on the marriage, Trina was forced to come live with Rex at his house, and within 2 years, she became pregnant. After the birth of her child, she took her baby and tried to run away from Rex, and she ran back to her family's new house, and she was hiding there, but Rex tracked her down. He took her and their baby back, and then Rex proceeded to burn her family's house down again, and again killed their new family dog. By the end of the 1970s, Rex wasn't only just the most hated person in Skidmore, he was the most destructive person. He had hurt so many people in town, but it seemed like no one could do anything about it. It was like he was untouchable. Then a single piece of candy changed everything. In 1980, one of Rex's children was at a local grocery store in Skidmore when they were caught stealing a piece of candy. When the shopkeeper asked the child to put the candy back, they refused, and it caused this huge fight, and before long, Rex has found out about this huge fight, and Rex, instead of being upset with his child for stealing, he becomes enraged that the shopkeeper had the audacity to accuse his child of a crime. And so Rex began stalking the owner of the store, a 70-year-old man named Bo, along with the rest of Bo's family. At all hours of the night, Rex would just show up in front of their house with a gun slung across his lap, and he would fire shots into the air, and then during the day, he would walk right up to Bo and he would tell him, "I'm going to kill you." And so Bo and his family knew it was only a matter of time before Rex did become violent, and they were right. In July of that year, Rex showed up at Bo's grocery store with a shotgun in hand, and Bo, who was in the back of the shop loading groceries through the back door, he turns around and he sees Rex walking up to him. They have this heated confrontation where at some point Rex just raises a shotgun and he fires a shot into Bo's neck. Bo was gravely wounded, but he would survive, and Rex would actually get arrested and would be charged with attempted murder. And it seemed like, for once, maybe Rex was actually going to get what was coming to him, but he didn't. The attempted murder charge was lowered to just assault, and he was given 2 years in prison, but he would only serve 1 day in jail before being released on bond. And as soon as he was out on bond, he went right to his house and he got his rifle that had a bayonet attached at the end of it, and he went right to the tavern in the middle of Skidmore, and he began telling anybody who would listen that he planned to finish the job, i.e. he was going to kill Bo, and he described in very graphic detail how he planned to do it, which involved this rifle and this bayonet. Patrons that were at the tavern that saw Rex and heard these claims, they were scared for Bo, and so they left the tavern and they told city leaders about these threats. And so city leaders at this point, they've had enough of Rex, and they decide they're going to host this secret meeting that will not include Rex the following morning. So the next morning comes around, and all these angry residents, they come to this meeting and they begin discussing, how are we going to handle Rex? We can't use police. We can't use politicians. Nothing can be done. So what are we going to do? How are we going to put an end to his reign of terror? And after a while, they came up with a plan. And after the meeting was done, everybody left the town hall, they got their guns, and they made their way over to the tavern where Rex was seen earlier that morning. About 40 of these armed men surrounded the outside of this tavern, and once they were all in place, another smaller group of men that were all armed walked inside the tavern, and they saw Rex sitting at the bar with Trina sitting right next to him. And so these men, they walk up right behind Rex, uncomfortably close, right behind him, and they just stand there with their guns looking at him. And at some point, Rex turns around and sees them, and he's about to lash out and start fighting them, but he realizes he's totally outnumbered, and these men that are standing all around him, they look like they mean business. And so he stands up, he grabs Trina, and he brushes past them, trying to act tough, and he walks out of the tavern. When he gets outside, he's taken aback at this additional group of armed men, which is much larger, who are all standing there just looking in at him. And so Rex at this point becomes visibly frightened, but he grabs Trina and he calmly walks out to his truck, which is parked a little ways out in front of the tavern. He gets in the driver's side, she hops in the passenger side, and Rex lights a cigarette up, he turns on his truck, and he's about to try to drive away when a gunshot rings out, and Rex immediately slumps forward onto his wheel. One of the Skidmore residents runs up to the truck, they open up the passenger side, and they grab Trina, who was unhurt, pulled her out, and rushed her to safety. Once she was clear, the other residents with their guns just moved in on the truck, and for 20 seconds they opened fire on Rex. After the shooting was over, nobody called an ambulance. Everyone just stood there and watched as the town bully died. In all, there were 46 witnesses that were there when Rex was murdered, but they all said they had either not seen the shooting or they didn't know who the shooter was. And despite a lengthy federal investigation, none of the witnesses ever changed their stories. And so as a result, no one was ever charged with Rex's murder. Years later, a Skidmore resident, when asked what happened here, they just said that man needed a killing. On the morning of March 18th, 1990, a young woman named Karen parked her car just outside of the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston, Massachusetts. This famous museum is home to over 15,000 pieces of priceless art from ancient Rome, medieval Europe, Renaissance Italy, Asia, the Islamic world, and 19th century France and America. The outside of this four-story building is strikingly plain, but inside is strikingly gorgeous. There is this lush green open-air courtyard that sits right in the middle of the museum that all of the galleries look down into. Karen was an art enthusiast, and she was a security guard at this museum, and that day she was on duty. After parking her car, she got out and walked her way over to the employee entrance, and there she pressed the buzzer and announced her arrival to the two night shift guards that she would be relieving. But after a few seconds, the night shift guards did not respond to her, and they did not unlock the door. And so after a little while, Karen pressed the buzzer again and said, "I'm here, can you please open the door?" But again, the guards that were on duty did not respond back to her, and the door did not open. This was highly unusual, so Karen left the door, found a payphone, and called the chief of security for the museum, who lived out in town, and told him she couldn't get in the building. And so about 10 minutes later, the chief of security shows up, and he takes Karen, and he walks her around to the other side of the building. He leads her up an outdoor flight of stairs to another entrance to the museum. He pulls out a big ring of keys, he finds the right one, and he opens the door. The entrance they were going through placed them in this dark hallway that stretched out straight in front of them, and then at the very end of the hallway on the right was this very brightly lit room that the door was wide open to, and that was the security office where the guards were supposed to be. And so Karen and the chief, they begin walking down this hallway expecting to get to the end of it and look inside this room and see these guards and get an explanation for why they didn't buzz Karen in the first place. But when they reach the end of the hallway and they look in this office, there's nobody inside of there. And now that they were up close, they could see the door leading into the security office had been smashed open. In fact, the doorknob to this door had been smashed off and was laying on the ground. And then next to it, right in front of them, was this metal crowbar. And then above them, the one camera that would have seen whatever had happened in the hallway, it had been turned around and was facing the wall. So Karen and the chief, they know they've stumbled on something that's probably really bad. They don't know what it is. They don't know if there's still people inside the museum. They don't know where the guards are. So the chief just grabs the crowbar for protection, and he and Karen run into the office and they call police. Although they didn't know it yet, Karen and the chief had just discovered one of the most famous crimes in history. The night before, 23-year-old security guard Rick Abath trudged his way down the walkway towards the employee entrance of the museum. He and another young man named Randy were scheduled to work the overnight shift that night. Rick hated his job at the museum because it was incredibly boring, but Rick didn't really have many other employment opportunities to choose from. He was a guy that had dropped out of music school and spent most of his time smoking marijuana, drinking beer, and playing in his friend's rock band. And so he just kept this job that he hated. Once Rick got inside the museum, he walked over to the office where he found his partner that night, Randy, was already sitting behind the desk. After chatting with him for a few minutes, Rick said he would do the first set of security rounds, and so he grabbed a walkie-talkie and a flashlight and he headed out to the exhibit halls. Almost immediately, a fire alarm went off. Rick went to the area where it was going off and he investigated and did not see a fire, and so he just turned the alarm off. The building was very old, and it wasn't uncommon for their electronics to fail or glitch. And so after this, Rick didn't think much of it. He continued doing his security rounds, and after about 30 more minutes of that, he made his way back down to the security office where he traded places with Randy. Rick took the seat behind the desk, and Randy took the walkie-talkie and flashlight and headed out into the exhibits. About 30 minutes later, while Randy was still doing his security rounds, Rick had his head down on the desk when he heard the sound of the buzzer coming from one of the outside doors. He lifted his head up and he looked at the screen that was connected to the camera, looking down at whoever was outside at this door, and he saw there were two police officers standing right outside the door. And so he reached over and he pressed the intercom button and he said, "Hey, can I help you?" And the officers said they were there responding to a disturbance call. Can they come inside? Now, Rick didn't know what this was about. He assumed it must have to do with maybe the fire alarm that had gone off earlier, or maybe somebody outside had seen someone trying to break in and they had called it in. But either way, he felt like it was important enough that he should let them in, even though it was against protocol to allow anyone into the museum after hours, including police. And so the two officers, they come through the doors and they wind up in the hallway right outside of the security office, and there's a window into the security office, so both the officers and Rick can see each other. And the officers immediately say to Rick, "Hey, are you working alone tonight?" And Rick says, "No, my partner is out doing security rounds. He'll be back soon." And so the officers just kind of nod their heads and they're looking around the room for a second. And one of them, as he glances at Rick again, he does kind of a double take and he goes, "Wait a minute. I think I know you. There's a warrant out for your arrest. You need to come out here and show me your ID." And so Rick is caught completely off guard, but he just kind of instinctively does what he's told because it's a police officer. And so Rick stands up, he walks out of the office, he goes out into the hallway, and as he's about to present his ID to the inquiring officer, the officer just grabs him, pushes him up against the wall, and handcuffs him. And so before Rick can say anything, Randy, his partner, comes back from doing his security rounds. He walks into the hall and has no idea what's going on. The other officer, the one that had not handcuffed Rick, grabs Randy and does the same thing, presses him up against the wall and handcuffs him. And so as Randy and Rick are standing there up against the wall with their hands behind their back, they're looking at each other, they're looking around thinking, what's going on here? And at some point, Randy just blurts out, "Why are we being arrested?" And that's when one of the officers just says, "Oh, you're not being arrested. You're being robbed." Rick and Randy were led by the imposter cops down into the basement of this building where they were bound and gagged with duct tape. And then these two thieves proceeded to spend the next 81 minutes walking all around the museum, ultimately stealing 13 pieces of art before destroying the security footage and then fleeing the building. Rick and Randy were discovered unhurt later that morning by police, still tied up in the basement. Despite dozens of suspects, numerous viable theories, and a massive monetary reward, these two art thieves were never caught and remain at large today. As for the 13 pieces of stolen art, one of which includes the extremely rare Rembrandt painting called The Storm on the Sea of Galilee, which is his only seascape in existence, they are still unaccounted for. And combined, they are worth a staggering $500 million.